In the bitter cold of a Belgian dawn, something that should never happen to a German panzer commander occurred. The roaring Tiger engine simply cut out. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper, barely 30 years old, but already one of the most decorated leaders in the Waffen-SS, slammed his fist against the turret hatch. The metallic ring echoed through the frozen darkness of December 17, 1944, at Hansfeld. His driver, standing in the compartment below, kept trying to fire up the massive 700 horsepower Maybach engine. Nothing but silence answered him. The fuel gauge had long since fallen to empty. From his position below deck, the driver called up in a voice tight with barely suppressed fear. "Both tanks are dry. The reserve is gone too." Peiper dropped himself down from the command tank, his boots striking the hard frozen Belgian earth with sharp cracks that seemed to announce their arrival to anyone listening. What surrounded him should have been Germany's pathway to victory. Operation Autumn Mist, the massive Ardennes offensive that German High Command had gambled everything upon, was represented here in this field. 67 tanks sat motionless. 149 half-tracks lay silent. Nearly 5,000 of the Nazi regime's most elite Waffen-SS soldiers stood idle in the pre-dawn fog, all held prisoner by empty fuel tanks. But something strange lay ahead through the mist. The town of Hansfeld itself, which the Americans had just abandoned, remained practically intact. The hastily retreating US forces had left behind something that would define this entire day. Fires still burned in oil drums. Coffee steamed in metal cups abandoned on tables. And then Peiper saw what made his pulse quicken. Jerry cans. Thousands of them. The distinctive olive-drab American fuel containers stretched in neat rows like a gift from fate itself. 5-gallon cans stacked and organized with an orderliness that was somehow both beautiful and terrifying. Peiper approached slowly, almost as though drawn by an invisible force. His adjutant, Hans Gruller, picked up one of the cans and sniffed. "High-octane gasoline, sir. The best quality." Peiper stood silent for a long moment, absorbing what this meant. As his men began the urgent work of transferring fuel from can to tank, Peiper moved through the stockpile like a man in a trance, counting quietly to himself. 50,000 gallons. The number seemed impossible. 50,000 gallons meant his entire division could push all the way to the Meuse River. This single captured depot contained more fuel than German panzer divisions had received in half a year. This fuel could change everything. This fuel could matter. Yet even as his soldiers worked frantically to top off their tanks, something twisted inside Peiper's chest, a realization that settled upon him like that same cold Belgian fog. If the Americans could abandon this quantity without apparent concern, if they could walk away from supplies that Germany would defend with entire army divisions, then something fundamental had broken in the balance between these two nations. Germany had done more than miscalculate. Germany had fundamentally failed to understand what it truly faced. Half a year earlier, in June 1944, Adolf Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, Albert Speer, had placed a report in front of the Führer that should have ended all German offensive plans immediately. The numbers inside were inescapable. Germany's synthetic fuel production, the very lifeblood keeping the Wehrmacht mobile, had been systematically pulverized by months of relentless Allied bombing campaigns. The Lunar Works, which had churned out 175,000 tons of fuel back in April, managed to produce just 5,000 tons by September. The great hydrogenation plants at Pollitz, Bleckhammer and Brucks operated at barely 10% of their former capacity. The story the numbers told was one of inevitable collapse. America produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil annually. Germany, counting every synthetic facility and every captured Romanian oil field, managed 33 million barrels, less than 2% of what America produced. The Third Reich was attempting to conduct modern mechanized warfare while running on less than 1/50th the fuel of its enemy. Logistics officers at German High Command had done the calculations. Major Friedrich Semmelmann, working in Wehrmacht logistics, had determined that the entire Ardennes offensive would require 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler had allocated 5 million gallons. But only half that amount had actually made it to the front lines, due to transport problems and bombing damage. The entire German High Command was betting the continuation of the war on one thing: capturing enemy fuel supplies, a strategy that screamed desperation rather than strength. The Americans, meanwhile, had built something that made German logistics look like horse-drawn supply wagons from an earlier century. Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean, stretched across the English Channel, carrying petroleum directly into France. The Red Ball Express, a continuous river of trucks, delivered 12,500 tons of supplies daily to the fighting front. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day. But they were receiving 1.4 million gallons daily. They were actually building fuel reserves while simultaneously fighting a war. Piper, at 29, was no fool. He had fought across the endless Russian steppes, where he had learned that fuel was more precious than bullets. He held the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, the highest combat decoration. He had been appointed commander of the 1st SS Panzer Regiment despite his youth. His unit had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the crucial spearhead, of this entire operation. Just 3 days before the attack began on December 14th, Piper had attended the final briefing at Rundstedt's headquarters. General Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th SS Panzer Army, had been direct with his officers. The message was stark and clear. You will reach the Meuse only if you capture American fuel supplies along the way. There was no backup plan. There was no second method. Piper's unit received a fuel allocation of 31,000 gallons. That was sufficient for 50 miles of hard combat operations. The distance to the Meuse River was 65 miles. The mathematics of failure had been written into the entire operational plan from the beginning. Before his column rolled out on December 16th, Piper issued orders that reflected the desperation underneath the operation's surface. Tanks would travel in single file to conserve every drop. Engines would shut down completely during any halt lasting longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel dumps was priority one, above every other tactical consideration, above even seizing key terrain. The contrast with how American units operated could not have been more stark. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the US 743 Tank Battalion, positioned just 20 miles from where Piper's columns were forming up, recorded a routine entry in the unit's daily diary. Fuel resupply received today, 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks are at capacity, so additional supplies are being held. This was standard practice for American forces. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, German artillery opened fire. The bombardment that launched Operation Autumn Mist consumed more ammunition in 2 hours than the Wehrmacht had allocated for entire operations years earlier. Even this remarkable display of firepower masked the fact that Germany was running on fumes. Piper's column began advancing at 7 in the morning, already behind schedule due to congestion on starting routes. The roads that appeared as highways on German military maps turned out to be narrow country lanes, many unpaved. Vehicles designed for the open plains of Russia struggled through tight Belgian forest roads. Traffic snarled within hours as panzer columns became hopelessly tangled. At Lanzerath, the first major objective, Piper encountered something unexpected. 18 men. A single American intelligence platoon, barely more than a squad of soldiers, held up the mightiest German armored column for almost 10 hours. While Piper's vehicles sat idling during this engagement, engines burning precious fuel, his precious reserve was bleeding away. When the German forces finally broke through and reached Hansfeld at dawn on December 17th, Piper's column had covered only 20 miles and already consumed 40% of their entire fuel allocation. At this consumption rate, his tanks would run dry before reaching the halfway point to the Meuse. Hansfeld itself was nothing special in the American military supply network. It was classified as a Class 3B depot, merely a forward refueling point for the US 99th Infantry Division. Yet what Piper discovered there would have supplied an entire German panzer division for months. One German officer, Hauptsturmführer Hansler, would later describe the scene in testimony. Pyramids of jerry cans stretched before us. Each can held 5 gallons. They were stacked 3 meters high and extended perhaps 200 meters across the ground. The Americans had not even attempted to destroy them. The captured fuel was high-octane aviation gasoline mixed with motor fuel, all of it grading 80 octane or higher. German vehicles, particularly the finicky Maybach engines powering the Tiger tanks, were engineered for 74 octane fuel. American gasoline was actually too refined, burning too hot, causing problems in several German vehicles. Still, Piper's men worked feverishly to transfer as much as they could carry. During the refueling operation, other discoveries emerged. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffmann found papers in the depot office. He spoke English, having worked in his father's import business before the war. Shipping manifests showed the journey of this fuel: Texas to New York across the Atlantic to Liverpool, from Liverpool across the English Channel to Normandy, from Normandy by truck another 400 miles to this small Belgian town. Over 6,000 miles travelled in less than 6 weeks. Hoffmann brought the papers to Piper. The Obersturmbannführer read them carefully, then crumpled them in his fist without comment. But Hoffmann saw his face go pale. Both men understood what those papers meant. Private Ernst Kahler found American newspapers dated December 15th, just 2 days old. The headlines carried a story that read like science fiction to German soldiers. A new fuel pipeline had opened from Cherbourg to Verdun. This single pipeline could deliver 300,000 gallons daily. One pipeline delivering more fuel in a day than Piper's entire force would consume in this entire operation. To understand the shock coursing through Piper as he absorbed this news, one must grasp Germany's petroleum crisis by late 1944. Since May, Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel production by 90%. The Luftwaffe was grounding aircraft simply because aviation fuel did not exist. Pilot training programs had been slashed from 250 flight hours down to 60 hours. The German Navy's surface warships had essentially ceased operations entirely. U-boats had been fitted with snorkels, running on batteries for extended periods to preserve their precious diesel fuel. On the German home front, no private automobiles had moved since 1942. Gasoline was so scarce that the Gestapo conducted investigations into the black market theft of individual liters. German farmers were returning to horse-drawn plows because fuel for tractors no longer existed. Meanwhile, the United States was producing 67% of the world's crude oil. The East Texas oil field alone pumped more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. American refineries were operating at such capacity that Standard Oil was experimenting with new petroleum byproducts simply because excess crude existed. With the 50,000 gallons captured at Hansfeld, Piper's columns pressed forward. They reached Bullingen and by noon on December 17th, captured additional supplies: rations, ammunition, maps showing locations of other American fuel depots nearby. But these maps also revealed a disturbing truth that haunted Piper. The Americans had fuel stockpiles everywhere. Every major crossroads had some kind of depot. The U.S. First Army alone maintained 3.5 million gallons in reserve across the entire battlefield. Piper continued driving eastward toward Ligneville, where his forces would commit an atrocity that would haunt history. 84 American prisoners would be executed. Even this war crime was rooted in fuel desperation. Piper would later claim he could not spare gasoline to transport prisoners back to holding areas. By evening on December 17th, Piper's spearhead reached Stavelot, site of a major American fuel depot. Over 2 million gallons sat in jerry cans spread across 15 acres of open ground. Here was enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse. Here was deliverance. As Piper's advance guard approached the depot, American engineers were already preparing. Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion had received warning of the German approach. His orders came from higher command, and they were unambiguous. Deny fuel to the enemy at all costs. Destroy rather than let them capture. The depot held 2,189,000 gallons of gasoline. Brewster gave the signal at 16:30. Engineers poured gasoline trails between the stacked cans. White phosphorus grenades were distributed to every soldier. Technical Sergeant Paul Solis threw the first grenade. The explosion was instantaneous and tremendous. A wall of flame shot upward, maybe 100 feet into the air. He would remember the moment clearly. Within minutes, the entire depot transformed into an inferno. Piper's lead tanks arrived to find a pillar of black smoke rising 1,000 feet into the sky. The fire would burn for 3 days, consuming enough fuel to power Piper's entire division to Antwerp and back again. One German soldier, Unterscharführer Weber, described watching his commander. The Obersturmbannführer stood on his tank turret, watching the flames climb into the sky. He said nothing for perhaps 5 minutes. Then he climbed down and spoke to me. They can afford to burn 2 million gallons to keep us from using it. What are we doing here? Across the Ardennes, American engineers were making the same decision. At Torpon, 1.1 million gallons burned. At Spey, 2.5 million gallons were destroyed. The total of deliberately incinerated fuel during the first week exceeded 8 million gallons. More fuel than Germany had allocated for the entire operation. The ability to casually destroy millions of gallons flowed directly from an American supply system that existed beyond German comprehension. The Red Ball Express alone had delivered 412,000 tons of supplies using 6,000 trucks operating continuously around the clock. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily. The operation itself burned more fuel than entire German army groups received monthly. By December 1944, Motor Transport Services employed 230 truck companies operating on color-coded supply routes. The system delivered 20,000 tons of supplies daily, including 3,000 tons of fuel specifically. Colonel James Snyder, Chief Logistics Officer for First Army, kept careful records. On December 18th, he noted, "Fuel received yesterday, 1,847,000 gallons. Fuel issued, 1,623,000 gallons. Net gain to reserves, 224,000 gallons." This notation was routine, almost mundane to American officers. They were building stockpiles while fighting. The pipeline network was even more impressive than the trucks. Operation Pluto pumped 1 million gallons daily across the English Channel from Britain. Inland pipelines extended throughout France. The Cherbourg to Paris line delivered 800,000 gallons daily. The Seine to Dieppe line moved 650,000 gallons daily. By December 1944, Allied forces in northwest Europe were consuming 7.5 million gallons daily, while receiving 8.2 million gallons daily. They were accumulating reserves during active offensive operations. As Piper pushed deeper into Belgium on December 18th, the impossible mathematics became clear. At Cheney, his forces captured another depot. 5,000 gallons consumed in just 3 hours of combat. Tiger tanks burned 2.5 gallons per mile in battle conditions. Panthers consumed 1.5 gallons per mile. In the difficult Ardennes terrain, consumption climbed by 40%. Hauptmann Otto Dingler, the maintenance officer for the 1st SS Panzer Regiment, recorded the brutal arithmetic. By noon on December 18th, we had consumed 67,000 gallons since the offensive began. We had captured perhaps 55,000 gallons. We were operating at a deficit, losing fuel rather than gaining it. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic through ultra-intercepts, knew exactly where Piper stood. General Courtney Hodges issued orders to every American unit. Enemy critically short on fuel. Destroy all gasoline stocks threatened with capture. That same day, American C-47s flew 360 sorties, delivering supplies directly to the besieged garrison at Bastogne. They dropped 160,000 gallons of fuel to surrounded soldiers. Americans were flying more fuel to one trapped garrison than Piper's entire command possessed. By December 19th, as Piper's forces engaged defenders near Stoumont, the fuel crisis had become an emergency. Tanks were being abandoned with full fuel tanks rather than being captured. Piper consolidated what remained, perhaps 8,000 gallons. Enough for one engagement or retreat, but not both. Not both. Meanwhile, Allied planners were preparing for the coming month. Brigadier General Maurice Gilland requested 245 million gallons for January operations. The request was approved without discussion. The approval took minutes. The contrast in every dimension was staggering. American vehicles were standardized for maximum efficiency. Sherman tanks consumed 0.8 gallons per mile compared to the Tiger's 2.5. American trucks achieved 8 miles per gallon even when fully loaded. Parts were interchangeable, maintenance was simplified, repair was swift. German forces operated a bewildering collection of captured and manufactured vehicles with wildly different requirements. French tanks needed different oil than German Panthers. Soviet trucks required different parts than German Opels. Every captured vehicle multiplied logistical nightmares exponentially. On December 20th, Piper received a radio message: fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Piper called his commanders together. Sturmbannführer Werner Pötschke was blunt about the situation. We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 kilometers away. According to later testimony, Piper addressed his gathered officers. Gentlemen, we have discovered we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. What we captured at Hansfeld, which seemed like a miracle at the time, was absolutely nothing to them. We cannot win this. I am telling you plainly, we cannot win. This realization was spreading through German high command like a contagion. General Hasso von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, would later write in his post-war account, "When I learned Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons, rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive was finished before it truly began." Colonel Friedrich von der Leiter, captured on December 23rd, told his American interrogators things that would be recorded. "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men have not seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure fuel by the liter. How can we fight such abundance? How does any nation fight such overwhelming plenty?" By December 21st, Piper was surrounded near L'Église. His tanks sat immobile, dead from lack of fuel. American forces encircling him, the 31st Infantry Division, the 82nd Airborne, the 3rd Armored Division, possessed a combined fuel allocation of 340,000 gallons on that single day. Piper possessed perhaps 1,000 gallons. Private First Class Richard McKinney, serving in one of the American units, wrote home in a letter that captured the moment, "We have Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain jokes that we use more fuel just heating up coffee than they have to power their tanks." The pivot north demanded more than 300,000 gallons, a logistical feat that German military planners deemed beyond possibility. Yet Patton's Third Army accomplished it in 72 hours. When December 23rd arrived, the weather broke clear across the Belgian countryside. 2,000 Allied sorties darkened the skies above the frozen landscape, each aircraft consuming fuel at a rate that would have crippled the Luftwaffe for weeks. Those thunderbolts burned 300 gallons every hour they stayed aloft. The Marauders devoured 200 gallons hourly. A single day of air operations consumed more petroleum than Germany's entire offensive allocation. On the night between the 23rd and 24th, Piper made his decision. He abandoned his vehicles and moved out on foot, slipping through the darkness with his remaining men. Of 119 tanks and assault guns that had thundered forward at the offensive's start, only 39 remained operational, and even these sat immobilized on the snowy terrain. The remaining fuel was used to destroy them, preventing their capture. Obergefreiter Heinz Goltz watched the destruction unfold. "We scraped together maybe 200 gallons from all the vehicles," he recalled. The Obersturmbannführer destroyed his own command tank personally. Millions of Reichsmarks in equipment rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. From the 5,000 men who began with Kampfgruppe Piper, approximately 770 made it back. They had driven 60 miles into American territory, located supply depots brimming with resources, and learned a devastating truth about their enemy's capability. Word of Piper's discoveries spread rapidly through German command channels. On December 26th, Field Marshal Walter Model received reports detailing what American supplies the Germans had found. His chief of staff documented the commander's reaction carefully. Model read through the quantities, then read them again. 50,000 gallons at Hansfeld. 2 million gallons burned at Stavelot. 8 million destroyed rather than captured by German forces. He spoke slowly. "We are not fighting the same war," Model said. Hitler received the briefing on December 28th and rejected the reality it presented. Speer documented Hitler's response. Hitler insisted the numbers were exaggerated propaganda. When shown photographs of the burning fuel depot at Stavolo, he dismissed them as Hollywood special effects. But enlisted men understood what their Führer refused to accept. Gefreiter Wilhelm Hoffmann wrote to his wife what he truly believed. Americans destroy more fuel in a single day than we receive in a month. They operate their tanks like we march on foot. This war is already lost. The fuel shortage revealed something far larger than a single campaign failure. By 1944, America produced half of the world's manufactured goods. New aircraft rolled off assembly lines every 5 minutes. The shipyards launched a vessel every 24 hours. Tank factories delivered an armored vehicle every 7 minutes. The petroleum figures were staggering by comparison. The United States refined 1.8 billion barrels. The Soviet Union extracted 110 million barrels. Germany, including its synthetic production, managed 33 million barrels. Japan produced merely 2.6 million barrels. Combined, the Axis powers generated less than 2% of America's petroleum output. Every major German offensive, launched after 1942, had been strangled by fuel constraints. Every American offensive unrolled backed by abundant supplies that German planners couldn't even visualize. On December 27th, Lieutenant Colonel Chester Hansen recorded a striking moment. A logistics officer mentioned that fuel deliveries had been reduced to only 500,000 gallons daily. Concern rippled through the room until someone pointed out this single day's allocation exceeded Germany's total offensive capacity. German prisoners taken from the Ardennes surprised their American interrogators more with their shock at waste than at firepower. Watching American soldiers discard half-eaten rations or burn gasoline simply for warmth shattered German morale more effectively than artillery bombardment ever could. Oberst Günther Reichhelm told interrogators what he'd witnessed. "We knew your production numbers in the abstract," he said, "but seeing soldiers squander more resources than our entire nation possessed made those numbers real." Every German soldier who saw American casual abundance returned to his unit with a single conviction: the war was hopeless. This knowledge spread through letters home despite military censorship. Gefreiter Müller wrote what many felt. Americans wash their clothing in gasoline, they feed chocolate to dogs, they fire artillery for Christmas, we cannot fight infinity. The psychological impact corroded German racial superiority ideology. How could supposedly decadent Americans possess such unimaginable wealth while the master race scrounged for basic necessities? During Nuremberg trials, German leaders repeatedly cited the same factor as decisive. Field Marshal Keitel testified before the tribunal. "We possessed operational superiority through 1940 and into 1941. By 1944, we couldn't move our forces due to fuel shortage, while Americans repositioned entire armies as easily as chess pieces." Piper himself, put on trial for the Malmedy massacre, offered revealing testimony about his own experience. Every choice after December 17th was constrained by fuel shortage. We couldn't maneuver effectively, couldn't pursue, couldn't retreat with any flexibility. Americans moved freely while we rationed every drop. General Heinz Guderian reflected on the strategic implications in his writings. When Piper captured 50,000 gallons, it meant everything to him, but it meant nothing to Americans. That disparity proved the war was already over. The Ardennes story resonates precisely because it marks the moment industrial warfare reached its culmination. Wars between modern nations would be determined by production statistics, not warrior courage or tactical brilliance. The romantic notion of warfare died in the snow among empty fuel cans. Military historian Richard Overy calculated that by 1944, Allied production advantages in major categories exceeded 5-1. In petroleum, the ratio approached 50-1. Such overwhelming advantages couldn't be overcome through superior training or tactical innovation. America produced 324,750 aircraft throughout the war. Germany managed 119,907. Americans built 88,410 tanks. Germany produced 46,857. But the most telling statistic concerned petroleum. America refined 1.8 billion barrels in 1944 alone, while Germany pieced together 33 million barrels. On December 24, 1944, as Piper's soldiers slipped through American lines on foot, leaving behind 39 abandoned tanks, 70 half-tracks, and 177 other vehicles, the enormity crystallized. They had captured 50,000 gallons, which initially felt like winning a tremendous victory, only to discover it was utterly meaningless to an enemy capable of burning millions. Under Officer Schaffer Averba reflected decades later in 1975. That morning at Hansfeld, when we discovered American fuel stocks, we celebrated as though we'd won the lottery. By evening, when we learned about Stavalo burning, we understood we'd already lost. Americans possessed so much they could destroy what Germans would die to acquire. The 50,000 gallons Piper captured represented less than a single American armored division consumed in 48 hours. It was less than the Red Ball Express burned through in 3 hours, a rounding error in Allied daily consumption calculations. Major General J. Lawton Collins later reflected on German strategic miscalculation. German desperate attempts to capture fuel revealed they'd assumed Americans valued fuel the same way they did, as precious and irreplaceable. They couldn't comprehend Americans possessed sufficient abundance to burn millions rather than risk any tactical disadvantage. Operation Watch on the Rhine failed because of inescapable mathematics of industrial warfare. The offensive consumed approximately 2.8 million gallons, 40% above the planned allocation, with captured supplies making up the difference. During the identical period, Americans consumed 267 million gallons, nearly 100 times greater consumption. The Wehrmacht lost 100,000 men, 800 tanks, 1,000 aircraft. Yet the most devastating loss was the shattering of illusions. Every German witnessing American abundance reached the same conclusion. Germany wasn't fighting a war, but participating in its own methodical execution. Piper himself survived, remaining imprisoned until 1956 on war crimes charges. On July 14, 1976, he was murdered at his French residence by unknown attackers. But 7 years before his death, in 1967, he spoke with historian Henry Lehmann about those December days. Finding that depot was the worst thing that could have happened, he reflected. If we'd run out of fuel earlier, we might have retreated with some dignity intact. Instead, we discovered Americans possessed oceans while we had mere drops. We discovered the impossible. The lesson transcends World War II itself. In industrial warfare between modern powers, logistics supersedes tactics. Production overwhelms courage, abundance defeats dedication. The German soldier of 1944 was arguably better trained and more experienced than his American counterpart. None of it mattered. Americans were backed by an industrial machine capable of wasting more than Germany could manufacture. This fundamental truth was encoded in every fuel dump at Hansfeld, every gallon burning at Stavalo, every pipeline spanning France. Wars between industrial powers would be decided by factories and refineries, not by brilliant generals or tactical doctrine. Colonel Trevor Dupuy calculated that in December 1944, each American soldier received 67 pounds of supplies daily. Each German received 3 pounds. Americans complained endlessly about waste and inefficiency. Germans would have considered American wastefulness unimaginable abundance. In 1984, 40 years after the battle, veterans gathered at La Gleiss, where the small museum displays Piper's Tiger tank, positioned exactly where it ran out of fuel on December 23, 1944. Former Unteroffizier Karl Wortmann stood beside the tank with former Staff Sergeant Roy Anderson of the 30th Infantry Division. "We always wondered why you stopped," Anderson said. "We thought it was some tactical maneuver." Wortmann laughed, though without humor. "We stopped because the tanks were completely empty," he replied. "You burned millions of gallons to keep us from using them. How were we supposed to fight that?" Anderson paused, then spoke quietly. "We never knew you were that short on fuel. We had so much we never thought about it." That single exchange captured the fundamental truth of December 1944. One side measured resources by individual gallons, the other by millions. One fought over each fuel canister, the other burned oceans of it. The outcome had been predetermined. German records provide stark documentation. Army Group B's war diary entries from December 1944 tell the story. December 16th. Offensive begins, fuel at 70% of minimum requirement. December 17th. Piper captures 50,000 gallons. December 18th. Multiple depots destroyed, 5+ million gallons lost. December 19th. Fuel situation critical, units immobilized. December 24th. Piper abandons vehicles, fuel exhausted. Meanwhile, First Army American reports showed a starkly different picture. December 16th. Reserves total 3.7 million gallons. December 17th. 2.2 million destroyed. December 18th. 1.8 million received. December 24th. Reserves remain at 4.1 million. Americans treated millions as a rounding error. Germans treasured individual cans. Beyond sheer quantity, American fuel represented technological superiority. Germans couldn't match. American refineries had perfected catalytic cracking, producing higher octane fuel more efficiently than German hydrogenation processes. American 100-octane aviation gasoline gave aircraft performance advantages over German planes operating on 87-octane synthetic fuel. Americans had perfected chemical additives Germany couldn't replicate. Tetraethyl lead, ethylene dibromide, detergent packages. German engines, designed for lower quality fuel, often ran poorly when forced to use captured American gasoline. Fuel shortages shaped every soldier's experience. Gefreiter Hans Müller recorded his observations. December 20th. Marched 30 kilometers, no fuel for trucks, past abandoned American vehicles with engines running for warmth. They leave engines running while we march through snow. Medical services collapsed under fuel constraints. Ambulances couldn't transport wounded from battlefields. Hospital generators couldn't run. Wounded soldiers died waiting for transportation that never arrived. Oberarzt Dr. Wilhelm Kirsting testified about the medical catastrophe. We had excellent surgeons and captured American supplies, but no fuel for ambulances. Men died during transport who could have survived with 10 kilometers distance. German propaganda about American weakness shattered when soldiers faced reality. They'd been told Americans were soft, incapable of sustained warfare. Then they discovered Americans could destroy more resources than Germany possessed in its entirety. Corporal's diary entry, December 28th, documented the morale collapse. Reports indicate serious morale deterioration among troops. Soldiers write letters describing American superiority, contradicting our narratives. But rumors spread faster than censorship can suppress. The German racial superiority mythology couldn't survive when confronted with American logistical prowess. General Jodl testified at Nuremberg about German strategic realization. After the Ardennes, we knew it was finished. We'd played our last card and discovered the enemy held all remaining aces. Recognizing German desperation, Allied leadership focused resources on destroying fuel production entirely. By February 1945, German fuel production halted completely. The Luftwaffe sat grounded, training flights cancelled. The Wehrmacht became static, destroyed piecemeal by mobile enemies with unrestricted movement. Spring 1945 brought surreal scenes as war approached its conclusion. German units surrendered from immobility rather than defeat. Entire panzer divisions sat helplessly while American forces drove past them. General Major Fritz Bayerlein described the final weeks. We had 42 operational tanks, experienced crews, ammunition. We had 300 liters of fuel, insufficient for reaching the next town. We destroyed our tanks and walked to captivity. American advances faced constraints only from traffic congestion created by vehicle abundance. Third Army alone fielded 15,000 vehicles. Kampfgruppe Piper's fuel crisis demonstrates precisely how industrial capacity determined World War II's ultimate outcome. When Piper stood among those captured jerry cans that December morning, he glimpsed a truth his nation couldn't escape. They fought an enemy whose waste exceeded their need. The numbers reveal everything. German offensive allocation, 5 million gallons. Fuel destroyed by Americans, 8 million gallons. Daily American consumption, 7.5 million gallons. Piper's capture at Hansfeld, 50,000 gallons. Percentage of American daily supply, 0.6%. The Battle of the Bulge killed 19,000 Americans, perhaps 100,000 Germans. It destroyed Germany's final reserves. Its lasting impact was spreading knowledge through German ranks about American incomprehensible abundance. Piper's discovery wasn't merely about fuel quantities, but about industrial warfare's nature. Victory belonged to whoever produced the most petroleum, steel, aluminum. Germany never possessed a realistic chance. The final irony emerged when American forces catalogued abandoned German equipment at La Gleice. They found 39 perfect tanks abandoned solely due to fuel shortage. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report noted the required fuel, 8,000 gallons. Classification, minimal. Source, local reserve. Time required, 4 hours. What proved impossible for Germans, obtaining 8,000 gallons to save their best tanks, was beneath American consideration. A routine request using local reserves exceeding Kampfgruppe Piper's peak strength. This was Piper's discovery at Hansfeld. Not merely that America possessed more fuel, but that American abundance operated at a scale rendering German scarcity irrelevant. The war ended when American industrial capacity mobilized fully. Hansfeld revealed what remained true since 1942. Germany fought the impossible, measuring defeat in gallons, while America measured victory in oceans. The Tiger tank sits in La Gleice's museum today, fuel gauge permanently empty, a monument to when tactical excellence encountered logistical reality and lost. Visitors ask why such formidable tanks were simply abandoned. The answer carries profound simplicity: no fuel. In industrial warfare, that single answer encompassed everything that mattered.